Welcome back to Legacy Ignited, where every story burns deep into the soul and leaves you forever changed. The storm was merciless, a blizzard so fierce it swallowed the earth and silenced the sky. Out in that frozen wilderness, Sioux boys stumbled along small feet, sinking in the snow, their cries stolen by the wind. No one was there to hear them, no one except a woman who should never have crossed their path. She dragged them from death's grip, sheltering them in her lonely cabin, not knowing that every second of her choice was tying her fate to theirs. Days later, when the storm cleared, a shadow appeared on the horizon, an unyielding warrior who had ridden through ice and hunger, driven by blood and fear. He came not just for his brothers, but for the woman who had saved them. And what happened next would change her life forever. Before we begin, if stories that stir your heart and keep you on edge mean something to you, make sure to subscribe, like, and share. Your support keeps these powerful tales alive. Thank you for being here. Now, let's step into the storm. The wind cut through the open plains like 1,000 knives, howling against the earth with a force that seemed determined to erase every living thing in its path. Snow swept across the horizon, blinding, merciless, and endless. It was the kind of storm that devoured whole towns and left behind nothing but silence. On that bitter day, most people had barred their doors, sealed their windows, and prayed the fury of the blizzard would pass without claiming another soul. But out there, hidden somewhere in the frozen white, 2 young Sioux boys stumbled through the storm, their small bodies trembling against the cold. They were no more than 10 and 12, their thin deerskin coats clinging to them, already soaked and stiff with ice. Their moccasins slipped on the frozen ground, and their breaths came in sharp, shallow bursts. The snow was waist-deep in places, dragging them down, stealing the strength from their legs. Every step felt heavier than the last. Their village was gone from sight, swallowed by the storm, and their cries for help were carried away by the wind before they could travel a few feet. They were alone, lost, freezing, and with the kind of fear in their eyes no child should ever know. Miles away, in a small cabin built at the edge of the timberline, a woman named Eliza Parker was stoking the fire. She was no stranger to winters. On the frontier, widowed young, she had learned to live with hardship, carving survival out of every season. That morning, she had set out to gather wood before the storm reached its full fury. But by the time she returned, the snow was already coming down in sheets. She knew the land, and she knew storms like this took lives. She whispered a prayer for anyone caught out in it, never knowing how close that prayer already was to being answered. As the hours dragged on, the wind rattled the cabin walls. Eliza sat by the fire with her shawl pulled tight, trying to drown the sound of the storm with her needlework. But then, through the roar of the blizzard, she thought she heard something faint, distant, but unmistakable. A cry at first. She told herself it was the storm playing tricks, the moaning wind sounding almost like voices. But then she heard it again, sharper this time. It was a child's cry. Eliza threw on her heavy coat, grabbed a lantern, and forced the door open. The storm slammed against her with blinding force, snow stinging her face like shards of glass. She could barely see beyond a few feet, but her instincts pulled her forward. She stumbled through the drifts, holding the lantern high, her boots sinking deep into the snow. And then there they were, 2 small figures huddled together near the tree line, their bodies nearly buried, their faces pale and streaked with tears. Her heart nearly stopped. Without thinking, she dropped to her knees beside them. Their lips were blue, their hands stiff with frostbite, beginning to set in. One boy clung to the other, whispering in a trembling Sioux tongue she did not understand, but fear needed no translation. They were dying. Eliza, think, she muttered to herself. She couldn't leave them there, not for a second. With strength she didn't know she still had, she pulled them into her arms, dragging them one by one back toward her cabin. The storm fought her every step, the wind trying to rip the children from her grasp, but she held on. She would not let go. Not tonight. By the time she stumbled back into the cabin, her body was shaking with exhaustion. She laid the boys down by the fire, stripped away their soaked clothing, and wrapped them in blankets. She rubbed their arms and legs, whispering encouragement, praying they could still hear her through the haze of cold. "Stay with me, little ones. You're safe now. You're safe." The younger boy whimpered, his chest rising shallowly, his eyelids fluttering. The older boy tried to sit up, his eyes darting around the strange room, filled with both fear and confusion. But when Eliza pressed a warm cup of broth to his lips. He did not fight her. Hunger was stronger than fear. He drank, and soon the younger one followed. All night, Eliza kept watch. She fed them, warmed stones by the fire to place at their feet, and wrapped her own shawl around them. When their teeth stopped chattering and their breathing grew steady, she finally allowed herself a trembling sigh of relief. Yet as the storm raged outside, questions gnawed at her. Who were these boys? How far had they wandered from their people? Would anyone come looking for them? And what would happen when they did? She knew enough about the tension between settlers and the Sioux to understand that her act of mercy could either be seen as salvation or an intrusion. Still, as she looked at their sleeping faces, the frost melting from their cheeks, she knew she would not have chosen differently. The blizzard did not ease until the third day. When at last the sun broke through, the world outside was unrecognizable. Snowdrifts towered higher than the fence posts, and the prairie stretched in endless fields of white. Eliza stepped outside, shielding her eyes from the brightness, her breath catching at the silence that followed the storm's rage. She wondered if the boys' village had survived, if their families were out searching, frantic with fear. Inside, the boys sat by the fire, wrapped in her quilts, watching her every move with wary eyes. They spoke softly to each other in their native tongue, words she could not understand but tones she recognized: brotherly comfort, shared fear, and the fragile relief of still being alive. Eliza knew she could not keep them. She would have to find their people, return them before suspicion turned to anger. But deep inside, she also knew something else. Saving these boys had already set something in motion. The storm had not only changed their fate, but hers as well. And somewhere out there, a warrior brother was already braving the snow, riding across endless miles, carrying a heart heavy with worry, and a promise he was determined to keep. What Eliza could not know was that his arrival would not simply bring gratitude, it would bring a reckoning that would alter her life forever. Somewhere beyond the whitened horizon, where the storm had left the plains broken and the world hushed, a lone rider cut across the frozen expanse. His horse, a dark stallion hardened by winter, moved with a steady determination, hooves sinking deep into the drifts, yet never faltering. The rider's braids were stiff with frost, his cloak snapping against the wind, and his eyes sharp, unyielding, never wavered from the trail ahead. This was Marto, elder brother to the two Sioux boys who now sat safely in Eliza Parker's cabin, though he did not yet know their fate. For 3 days he had ridden without rest, pushing through the storm when others in his village had urged him to wait. He could not wait. He had woken that night to the news that his brothers had not returned from their errand before the storm struck. Some believed they were already gone, taken by the cold, swallowed by the storm's merciless hunger. But Marto refused to believe it. As eldest son, he bore the weight of his family, and as a warrior of his people, he bore the vow to protect them. He would ride until his body broke, until the land itself stopped him. His brothers were out there, and he would not return without them. The storm had punished him, tearing the breath from his lungs, freezing the sweat on his skin, and driving snow into his eyes until the world blurred into shifting white. Yet he pressed on, guided by instinct, by the faintest tracks when he could find them, and by prayer when all signs vanished. He whispered to the spirits, to the ancestors who had walked the land before him. He asked them for strength, for direction, for mercy. Every mile was a battle, but his heart carried him forward. At dawn on the 4th day, as the first weak rays of sunlight struggled across the plains, Marto spotted something: tracks, faint, nearly erased by the storm. But there, too, sets of small footprints, dragging, staggering. He dismounted and knelt in the snow, his calloused fingers brushing over the marks, his breath caught. These were his brothers. He could see it in the uneven steps, in the way the smaller one had stumbled, and the older had steadied him. They had come this way. Hope flared in his chest, burning against the cold. He followed the trail, his stallion walking beside him, the prints leading toward the edge of the timberline. But then they disappeared, lost in the drifts, where the storm had piled the snow high. Marto scanned the horizon, his chest tightening, and then smoke, a thin trail rising against the pale sky, curling above the trees. A cabin, his jaw set. Could strangers have taken the boys? Were they safe or in danger? Every step toward that smoke tightened a knot in his chest. He had grown up hearing stories of settlers who mistrusted his people, who treated them as less than human, who struck before asking questions. The thought of his brothers in such hands sent a cold fury through him. He urged his horse forward, faster, until at last the cabin came into view. Inside, Eliza had just set down a bowl of porridge before the boys when the sound of hooves shattered the quiet. She froze, her hand lingering on the table. The boys looked up sharply, their faces pale, and exchanged quick words in Sioux. Eliza's heart pounded. She knew this moment would come. She had prayed for it and feared it in equal measure. Whoever had come was here for them. The door rattled as a fist pounded against it, once, twice. Then a voice thundered through the walls, a voice deep, commanding, filled with urgency. The boys leapt to their feet, their eyes wide with recognition. "Mato," the older one cried, rushing toward the door. Eliza's breath caught. Their brother. She opened the latch, and the storm's bitter air swept inside as the door creaked open. Standing there was a towering figure, snow clinging to his braids and cloak, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. His eyes swept past Eliza without pause and locked on the two boys. In an instant, he dropped to his knees, pulling them into his arms with a cry that broke through his warrior's steel. The older boy buried his face against him. The younger clung with trembling hands. Tears froze on their cheeks, but for the first time since the storm began, they were safe in the arms that had sworn to protect them. Eliza stood back, her hands pressed to her chest. She felt the raw force of the moment, the bond of blood stronger than anything she could imagine. Yet as Marto held his brothers, his eyes finally lifted to hers, and in that gaze was more than relief. There was fire. He rose, slowly, his brothers still clinging to him, and stepped inside. The door shut behind him with a heavy thud. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the air charged with tension. He studied Eliza with piercing eyes, measuring her, questioning without words. Who was this woman? Why had she taken his brothers in? What had she done to them? The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Finally, Marto spoke, his voice rough from days of shouting into the wind. His English was halting, but clear enough. "You saved them." Eliza swallowed, her voice steady despite the fear pressing against her ribs. They were out in the storm. I couldn't leave them. They would have died. Marto's jaw tightened. He looked down at the boys, saw the color returning to their cheeks, the warmth in their blankets, the food in their hands. His chest rose with a heavy breath, torn between suspicion and gratitude. He had ridden for days prepared to fight, to tear down walls if needed, but what he found instead was mercy. The younger boy tugged at his brother's sleeve, whispering words in their tongue, pointing at Eliza. Marto listened, his expression softening by a fraction. He turned back to her, his eyes shadowed with something unspoken. Then, to her surprise, he bowed his head slightly. Not low, not submissive, but a warrior's nod of respect. "You saved my blood," he said. "For this, I will not forget." Eliza felt the weight of his words settle over her, heavier than the storm itself. She had not acted for thanks, nor for reward. But in that moment, she understood her choice had reached far beyond to freezing children. It had touched the heart of a warrior, a man who had ridden through death's jaws to find his brothers, and his promise would not fade with the snow. Yet she also sensed something deeper in his eyes, something unsaid. His arrival was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. For hours Marto stayed in the cabin, his brothers clinging to him as though afraid he might vanish if they let go. Eliza kept to the corner, tending the fire, her presence quiet but steady. She felt like an intruder in their reunion, yet every glance from the boys reminded her she had a place in their survival. They looked at her not with fear, but with trust. When the wind eased and the night fell calm, Marto rose. He told his brothers, in their language, they would return to the village by morning, their faces lit with relief. But before sleep claimed them, the older boy turned to Eliza, placed his small hand over his heart, and whispered, "Thank you." The words were broken, but clear enough. Eliza's throat tightened. Later, when the cabin grew quiet, Marto stood by the door, watching her. His shadow stretched across the firelight, tall, unmoving. Finally, he spoke. "Why?" Eliza lifted her eyes. "Because no child should die in the snow." His gaze held hers, searching. Then, slowly, he nodded. But instead of leaving, he reached into the pouch at his side and drew out something small. Wrapped in hide, he placed it on the table between them. She hesitated, then unwrapped it. Inside was a necklace, a single carved bone feather strung with sinew, polished smooth by years of wear. "This belonged to our father," Marto said. "He was a warrior. He is gone now. I give it to you." Eliza stared, stunned. I can't." "You can," Marto interrupted firmly. His eyes burned with intensity, yet softened with gratitude. "You carried my brothers from death. You gave them breath when the storm stole it. This gift is not payment, it is blood. It is memory. When you wear it, our family walks with you." Her hand trembled as she held the necklace. She had expected anger, suspicion, perhaps even blame. Instead, she was being entrusted with something sacred. Her heart swelled, her eyes misted. In all her years of loneliness, in all the silence of her cabin walls, no one had ever honored her like this. The boys stirred in their sleep, murmuring softly. Marto glanced at them, his expression gentler now. "They will grow, they will fight, and when they do, they will remember the woman who saved them." He paused, then added, "So will I." Eliza lowered her gaze to the necklace in her palm. It was more than a token. It was a bond, a promise that crossed divides of language, blood, and fear. She realized in that moment her act had done more than save two boys, had carved a bridge between two worlds. When dawn came, Marto and his brothers rode away, their figures shrinking against the rising sun. Eliza stood at the door, the feather necklace resting against her chest, her fingers curled around it as though holding on to their presence. She knew life would return to its rhythm, the firewood, the solitude, the endless prairie. But nothing would ever be the same. For somewhere out there, a warrior carried her memory as fiercely as he carried his brothers. And in the silence of her cabin, she carried his dot. The blizzard had ended, but what it left behind would last forever.